Good evening and welcome. My name is Leif Stenberg. I'm the new director of the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. And it's actually the first time I introduce some guest ever. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Parin Dossa. Parin Dossa is a professor of anthropology and an associate member in the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. Her ethnographic work has focused on Muslim women in Canada, Lamu in Kenya, Afghanistan and India. Her research interests include displacement, inequality and injustice, structural violence, disability, storytelling, memory work and diaspora. Her long-standing interest on displacement and critical feminist ethnography has led her to focus on the interface between social inequality, health and gender. Based on her research on social suffering and narratives of trauma, Dr. Dossa explores the differential effects of structural violence on the lived realities of Muslim women, including the diaspora. She grounds her analysis in methodologies that capture the reconstitution of lives on the margins of society. Among her many publications, I think it's actually most fun to mention the Afghanistan Remembers, Narrations of Violence and Culinary Practices from 2014. So it's with great pleasure, I warmly, cordially welcome Dr. Dossa to the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations.
Thank you. So I would like to refer to the PowerPoint as I talk. So how would I do that while sitting?
You can stand up. You can stand up.
I can stand up, right?
Here.
Okay. So the topic that I will be addressing today is storied lives of Muslim women in the diaspora. And before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the countries that I have visited and the kind of data that I have collected using ethnographic methods. So one of the countries that I visited was Porbandar in India, and I looked at the lives of Muslim women because that is the focus of my study. So this is Porbandar. It is a city now, and within this particular city, I want to draw your attention to the disenfranchised status of Muslims, Muslim families. So if you look at this particular slide, you would see that, this is the Muslim area. They live in one particular designated space, and you can see that it is in a need of repair. This is also in Porbandar. And what I want to emphasize, and this is the reason why I'm starting with this particular a slide, is to kind of emphasize the agency of women, the resourcefulness of women, the resilience of spirit that they deploy in the context of everyday life. So here in Porbandar, there are these women who are actually weaving fishing nets, because Porbandar is on the coast, it's a port. And fishing is one of the viable industries in place. And so what happens is that some businessmen would give them the materials for the net and ask them to weave, giving them very low wages. But the women, by remaining together in the context of a network of relationships, they in fact make the best of the situation, is revealed by the fact that in their everyday lives, they sustain themselves, through nourishment, through social ties, and also through whatever wages they can earn. This is another woman in Porbandar. She is actually cleaning and cutting the fish. You get very fresh fish if you were to go there. You just just delicious. We don't get them everywhere. So then I've gone to Iran, but my work on Iranian women was actually took place in Canada, in Vancouver. And I looked at Iranian women in the context of diaspora, and I will refer to them, but I just wanted to show you the map to bring home the point that Iran is like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, Pakistan. It occupies a geopolitical place, and so because of the geopolitics, the Western world is heavily intervened in these particular areas, as you already know. So this is where I did my research. This is Vancouver, and this is where the Iranian community lives in North Vancouver. And you can see, how hard they are trying to integrate, to form part of the fabric of Canadian society, because they have, English and Farsi, and again, these are Iranian sweets. And it's not that their consumption is confined to the Iranian community, but during festivals, like Nowruz is a major festival. During festivals, they do outreach work. For example, if the women are attending English as a second language class, they would take the sweets for other women. And in that way, they are letting other people know, what, some aspect of their culture. So the point I'm making is, how, their resourcefulness and their attempt to integrate into Canadian society, not always, with viable results, because, there is, of course, structural exclusion and discrimination and racism, as I was to learn from their stories. So what I want to do, so I just wanted to give, that was the backdrop, just to let you know a bit about my research. Now, my particular topic, I want to start by exposing, first of all, give an exposition of the terms like stories, diaspora, and Muslim women. I do not take these terms as given. They need to be, talked about, they need to be discussed. And so when it comes to stories, it's not just a matter of sitting down with a research participant and collecting the story. It's not just that we are just merely interested in their stories, because that stories can be easily appropriated, right? So what stories do, I want to highlight the function of stories. So what the stories do is, first of all, they bring to light the palpable realities of socially marginalized groups. For socially marginalized groups, it's very important that they are given the space to tell their stories, because if they are asked to converse in the mainstream language or the dominant language, they are silenced. Their response would be very minimal. But when you ask them to tell their stories, then you are able to acquire glimpses of their lives. Through stories, we can actually understand the structural factors that are at work. No individual is free from larger forces that impact on our lives. So when a woman tells me that I am eating stale bread and this is what I'm giving to my family, she's making a politicized statement. She's saying, look, now I do not have the resources to feed my family nutritious food. So what I have to give them is stale bread. And that's politicized because, it's kind of a critique of the larger society that has failed to provide for this particular woman and her cohort and her families and the families. So, my point is that when we collect stories as researchers, we need to identify the structural factors at work, not only look at, stories in isolation. But I think an important point here is that through stories, we can actually engage into dialogue and conversations. It is, if you want to dialogue and converse with, people who have otherwise been silenced. For example, let me give you, a very simple scenario, and I will, refer to Canada because that's where I'm from. So when, racialized minorities or women from the non-Western part of the world come to Canada, they are invariably given the message that they should be grateful that they are in Canada. That, for example, if somebody comes from Syria, and they're told, oh, well, your country is subject to violence and civil strife. And so the fact that you have come here, you should be grateful. Now, what is hidden here is that the situation in Syria cannot be understood in isolation from larger political events. So if you want to look at the recent history of how, Syria has been positioned in a manner whereby, its infrastructure has been destroyed, and thousands of people have lost their lives, millions of people have been displaced, then we have to kind of immediately, in the immediate period, we have to look at the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. Like, Afghanistan was attacked, and I know, I recognize that there was a tragedy in terms of, the incident that happened in that is referred to as 9/11, but you do not go and destroy a whole country. You do not go and destroy the you do not go and bomb a whole country. And so in 2001, Afghanistan was destroyed in terms of its infrastructure. It was militarized, it was occupied, and then the United States and its allies moved to Iraq, 2004. And, in Iraq also, it was militarized, invaded, and then, of course, it was spilled over into Syria. And so that's what we are witnessing. And it's not just Syria, now it's Libya and it's Yemen. And the situation in Yemen is not even talked about, but there has been as much violence there as well, not brought about by the people themselves, but through the intervention of outside powers. So what I'm suggesting here is that, it is through the stories of people that we begin to recognize the impact of violence in the inner recesses of life. Violence does not just happen that your house was bombed or you lost one or two family members. Its kind of effect continues for generations. And so it is through listening to their stories that we have an understanding of the impact of violence. But more to my point that, for example, when Syrians come to Canada, they are told, oh, you should be grateful. But essentially the script that should be highlighted and which the media never ever foregrounds, unless you go into alternative media, is that it's not an issue of being grateful. It's an issue of being entitled. It is their entitlement, because these people, the people in Syria and other parts of the world, are subject to suffering, and they're subject to violence because of the militarized and market-based intervention policies of the powers, of dominant powers. And so it is an issue of entitlement. And so when you are told that, oh, you have come to our country and you should be grateful, then you are silenced. Because then you can't tell your story. You should be grateful, so just try and integrate, forget about the past. But how can you forget about the past when, you lost your family members, your house has been destroyed, your everyday life has been disrupted. So I think these are the issues that we need to talk about. So I didn't want to just dismiss these terms as stories and what do we mean by stories. It's not just a, I don't mean it in a superficial way. When I refer to stories, I'm kind of trying to bring to light the in-depth understanding of what insights stories can provide. So, you know, it is through stories that participants, people who have been subject to violence, they kind of engage into the act of witnessing. They witness, they engage in the act of self-witnessing. And it was Veena Das who said that not to be able to, you know, understand the suffering of another person is not a failure of the intellect, it's a failure of the spirit. And it is in this light that we, you know, use stories. So how stories are read, when stories are being relayed by participants, new meanings are created that reverberate into our own lives. So, you know, ultimately it brings to light the fact that they revealed the world that we ought to know, a just world, a world of social justice and equality. And so it was Trinh Minh Ha who said that it will take a long time to tell the story, but it must be told. Okay, so I'm going to go through this very quickly, but also, you know, stories bring to light, you know, unarticulated knowledge. Alternative knowledge does not come to light. Because if I were to sort of just ask, you know, if I were to ask you, for example, tell me your story. I think if you were to relay a story to me, I would learn. I would learn about issues that I would not be able to read in the literature, because it is your life experience that, you know, you would relate to me. And some stories, I won't go too much into detail because I know we might run short of time, but the stories kind of remain in the borderline between oneself and the other. So it's never a case whereby the other person is distant from the participant. I'm an anthropologist, and we anthropologists, when we go into the field, we try to establish a connection with our participants. We do not remain distant. So it calls into question our taken for granted reality. You know, I always tell my students, you know, why do you not question the excessive consumerism that we are compelled to engage with? Why don't we question it? Why don't we question our taken for granted reality? And it comes to light through stories. So stories can also be a bridge between here and there. And when I talk about here and there, I refer to the divide that exists now in the world between the global north and the global south. The global north is the Western world, the global south is the non-Western world. So let's move on. So what do you mean by diaspora? And it's important to define these terms, okay? So diaspora, to begin with, the term came into being, you know, to refer to the experiences of forced displacement, okay? But now it has acquired multiple meanings. Because if I were to take my family, for example, so my family could be living in United States, in different parts of Canada, in Britain. So it's kind of spread all over the globe. And so it can, you know, then it acquires this particular trans-border stance of trans-border identities, whereby we come to know about border knowledge. And what we mean by border knowledge is that we don't confine ourselves within the unit of the nation state. So if I have a relative living in the United States or Britain, then I'm able to draw upon the experiences of my relative in Britain, in Canada, and United States. So there's border knowledge, right? And then it's women's positionality. You know, in the diaspora, it has been found, literature shows that women play a very important role in remaking our world. So from this particular point of view, women can, you know, transform threatening spaces into familiar terrains and endow them with meaning. Because when it comes to homemaking, women are the ones who play an important role, and that does not exclude men. In the literature, now when we talk about gender and we talk about women's lives, we always talk about women relationally. That means women and men or the intersectional paradigm. So bringing in other variables like age and ethnicity, class, and whatever variables that differentiate us as people can be included under the umbrella of intersectionality. So it is actually within the diaspora that there is a bottom-up recovery work, because when we have been displaced, we also engage into recovery work. Who are Muslim women? Now, this is also a point, or this is also a construct that needs to be problematized. Muslim women are not homogeneous. It would be a misperception to think that all Muslim women just occupy the same space, and the Western media by and large portray women as being subject to oppression by their culture and by their religion, which is a misnomer, and this needs to be corrected. So in terms of the appropriation of their lives, the media is very fond of focusing on hijabi women. And the media, if the mainstream media were to engage into some research, they would find that hijabi women themselves have such differential perspectives. After 9/11, more and more Muslim women chose to wear the hijab because they wanted to occupy that particular space in the public sphere to, in fact, make a statement that we are Muslims and we are here to fight for our rights. But this is the image that the media does not capture. So there are hijabi women, there are non-hijabi women. And so there is heterogeneity that's not taken into account. And that's why, the term Muslim women is of interest. And it also kind of serves to define them and us. So we need to move away from that. And what we need to focus on is that Muslim women are engaged in seeking their rights. That's the bottom line. That's the starting point. They want to acquire their rights, which, and I'm not saying that these rights are confined within the family or communities. They, in fact, entail looking at the nation state where they are residing and looking at the global world. Okay, so writing this location, telling her story. So I did state that I am going to share some stories with you, to kind of give, more flesh and bone to what I'm saying, okay? So I want to share the story of Firuze. Now, she is, I talked about, my work with Iranian women in Canada. And I chose Firuze's story because she occupies a space that one would say is margins of the margins, because she is a woman with a disability. Note that I'm not saying disabled woman, because that would be a wrong term. Persons with disabilities, the personhood is first, disability is a secondary identity. So Firuze came to Canada. I won't go into too many details because I think we might want to leave some time for questions and your comments. But she came to Canada following her husband, who was also a man with disability. What happened is that when she was in Iran and when she was young, she met with an accident and she never recovered from it. So she was confined to a wheelchair. And then she was living in a village. So she went into the city, Tehran, and she joined a particular group where she was, acquired training to work in a factory. And here she met her husband, who was also using a wheelchair. So then they decided to get married. And she kind of showed me, a newspaper cutting whereby, it stated in Farsi that this is the first time that man and a wife and a husband, both of them being on wheelchairs, have got married. And she took so much pride, that they were the first couple to get married. Then her husband was what is known as para-Olympic. And so he actually came to Canada and sought asylum. He was granted asylum, and he stayed in Canada. He tried to get a job, but the prejudice and the discrimination against persons with disabilities, he didn't get a job. He applied for his wife to join him, and it took 8 years before she could join him. But when they were in Iran, they raised 4 children. And Firuze's story is very interesting. It is in my book called Politics and Poetics of Iranian Women in the Diaspora. And, right from the time she got married, she kept on telling her husband, look, we don't have legs, but we have brains and we have faith. So this was her encourage. And she said that, well, I raised my 4 children with love. And what she would do is whenever she had to go somewhere, and she would put her baby or her child in the wheelchair, and then ask the taxi driver to help her. And, she just got around because of the Emilia, whereby she sought some help. And then when her husband came to Canada, he applied for visas. And after 8 years, she did receive the visas to come to Canada. But nobody explained to her what she had to do. I think like all Western countries, Canada also has a political agenda. So it only has embassies in countries from which it wants immigrants. So Iran was one country that was singled out as undesirable. Okay. So Firuze was told, she was in Iran, she was told that you have to go to Syria to get your visa. So she said, how can I travel to Syria? I'm in a wheelchair. But she was told, you don't have a choice. You have to go to Syria. So, by collecting money, getting tickets, she did travel to Syria, went to the embassy, but it turned out to be a public holiday. So she had to wait there. She had very few resources materially, but she had to wait there for a day. And the second day, the visa office told her, why have you come here? You already have the visa. She said, nobody told me that I already have the visa. So she went back to Iran, and she was told that you only have 2 days left to travel. Otherwise, you lose your visa. I talked about the resourcefulness of women. And she says, they told her that now in 2 days, you won't be able to go to Canada. So you just give up your visa. And she said, no, I cannot do that. She was so firm. But she had to pay, there was a price that the family had to pay, because by this time, her eldest son had passed, he was over 18, and he was not allowed to go with the family. So with 3 children, she went she came to Canada and joined her husband. But her husband refused to go out with her. He said, oh, in this country, 2 people on wheelchairs should not be seen together. Then she says, oh, but I never had this problem in Iran. We used to go out together everywhere. And here there is so much discrimination that we should not be seen in the public sphere because we are racialized persons with disabilities. So what I want to we have a particular limit in terms of time, or did you have a limit in terms of?
We scheduled for 7, but we started on 10 minutes. So if you want to continue to 10 minutes past 7, that's fine, I think. Okay. So I will make sure that we leave some time for interaction. Okay. So I just identified, because my topic is, story lives of Muslim women. I want to identify some particular moments from Firuze's narrative. So the first one was the broken wheelchair. So what happened was that Firuze went
attended English as a second language classes. These are offered to new immigrants. And once her wheelchair broke, so she phoned her social worker and she said, my wheelchair is broken. But the social worker told her that, our people are on holidays, so your wheelchair will not be repaired for 2 weeks. Now, Firuze here, is a woman who doesn't speak very much English. And of course, she was also given this message that you have to be grateful that you are here. So she then uses body language. She says, oh, in her narrative, in her story, as she was relaying it to me, she said, I sat on the sofa for 2 weeks while they were on vacation. She's giving a very powerful message. She says, they prevented me from doing my work. So I find this extremely powerful because she is not considering herself or herself disabled, but she is saying, I'm a mother. I have 3 children. I cook every day. I go to English as a second language class, and now I just can't do anything. I'm sitting here on the sofa, and I read this as body language. A person who is a letter. It's a fun argument. The second narrative moment, he is taking a bus. Okay, so she said that whenever she came back from classes, and she would get the bus stop, and sometimes the bus driver would not take her on, and she has a very good understanding as to why he would not take her into the bus. Well, if he asks me to get into the bus, he has to tie my seatbelt, he has to put down this for me, but he doesn't know that I can do this myself. She had learned, she's ingenious, and she doesn't know thinking. If I'm late, how am I going to prepare a meal and serve it to my children? So, here is a woman, the margins of the margins, and she is telling these stories. That's why I gave you the background information about the value story. So there was a second incident. And third one, narrative moments, was my kids are hungry. So she and her husband were not given jobs. And, there is evidence that, persons with, if they, are given some training, they can work. Disability is just part of their identity. It is not their full identity. Okay? So essentially, they were never ever placed in the workforce. And so she says, well, we ran out of money. And so when we ran out of money, I went to the welfare office and I said, there are 2 weeks left to the end of the month. And if you can just give me advance. She didn't ask for more money, just give me advance. And the welfare officer just refused. Then she had a friend, and she phoned her friend, and she explained the situation to her friend. Then her friend talked to the welfare officer and convinced her to give her the money. So she said, she gave me $70. I bought groceries. I went home. I cooked. My children came and hugged me. She said, it's after 2 weeks that we have eaten a good meal. So, this is how you would bring to light the fact that, through stories, people who are disenfranchised do engage into agency. They are actors. They are not victims. I never, ever write about my participants as victims. Okay? So now I went to Afghanistan, 2009, 2011. I went to Afghanistan because I wanted to highlight this one particular script that I already talked about. Because when I went to Afghanistan, the media had presented Afghanistan as a country that need to be saved, that the Western world had to, go into Afghanistan, introduce democracy, and free the women of Afghanistan who were in burqas. And later on, I might show you some slides, okay? So, United States, used this as a rationale to go into Afghanistan and militarily occupied the country for 15 years. Now, prior to that, if you want to know about the historical background of Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the then Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, stayed there for 10 years. It was the height of the Cold War, so United States went in, fought a proxy war by arming the factions, the anti-communists, and the Russians. They armed those who were leaning towards communism. So when Soviet Union left Afghanistan in 1979, the whole country was turned into an armed camp. It was turned into an armed camp, and I might just read from my, I probably left my bag somewhere, I don't know, probably over there. But anyway, if you can get my bag, I want to read just a very short passage, showing, the militarization of Afghanistan. So anyway, so it's the system. They did not, the media did not bring to light the script that, this is what happened to Afghanistan. Instead, they talked about, how we have to liberate these women of Afghanistan and so forth. So I, again, using stories, I took the life narrative of, I took the narrative of Hamida, and she went through an extreme form of suffering. Because what happened was, they were not that well-to-do, but she and her husband, Ahmad, they had gradually, brick by brick, they had built a home. And when Afghanistan was invaded, they were forced to leave their home and go to Iran, which was the country closer to where they were residing. So she said that we moved back and forth. And when, Karzai was elected as the president of Afghanistan, the Afghans in Iran were forcefully repatriated. So they came back to Afghanistan, but their house was destroyed because of war. And they did not have any choice but to work for a school director who, of course, abused them. And this kind of abuse happens when there is no infrastructure, there's no law and order. And then she says that, well, I worked as a cleaning woman in the school. My husband worked as a gatekeeper, and we had to put in long hours of work. And then she talked about her children. She said that my eldest son has run away from home because they were given a dark, dingy room with no kitchen, they had to use an outhouse. And it was just a little tiny room. And so her eldest son ran away from home. Her second son, he put gasoline in the scarf and started sniffing. And her daughter, she had a nervous breakdown. So she talked about, how her children embody the scars of war. So, and then, she and her husband would always have a conversation, so let's make our children work because, we are not able to make our ends meet. And she put her foot down and she said, my children will not work. My children will get an education. And, I do not want them to suffer the way we have suffered. So then she used a very powerful statement. She said, when night comes and the next day there is day, but for me, the day is also night. So in other words, I don't have any light in my house, symbolically. And, so my conclusion is, I'm not going into details, is that through her life and the bodies of her children, Afghanistan remembers. So my whole point of going to Afghanistan was to bring to light the script about remembering what the world had forgotten And as an anthropologist, I did not want to do this from the point of view of an expert. I did not want to take that position that, I am the one who can highlight the script. I wanted the script to come from the women. And so this is the role that Hamida played. And she was very, very resourceful. Before she would go to work in the morning, the children would be sleeping and her husband would be sleeping on mattresses on the floor. And she would, fold the mattresses and put them behind the curtain and convert it into a living room. Just leaving one mattress for people to sit on. And I always sat on that mattress whenever I visited her, because that was for the guests. So, again, not constructing her as a victim, but at the same time being cognizant of her suffering. So my point is that the violence is not acknowledged by the outside world, and then it calls for a societal response when we bring to light the stories and what happens to individuals when they are subject to war and violence. I think I'm going to skip this particular story because I do want to show you some slides. But this is Mina, and if I have time, I can summarize it. So can we have the second slide, number 3 pictures? I want to show you 2 more slides, okay? So it's number 3 pictures, yeah. Okay. So, my goal, ultimately my goal is to show that all the Western world presents itself as being separate and polarized from the non-Western world. We need to establish connections. We need to establish connections between the 2 worlds if we are to bring social justice, if we have to work towards social justice. Because it's not that we should not buy the script that the West has militarized Afghanistan or other countries just to save these countries. So I have a map of Afghanistan, Kabul, where I did my research. I did go to Bamiyan, but that was just for a very short period of time. And so this is Afghanistan, this is Canada, country where I live, and it is my home in a way, because I come from Uganda and I was also rendered a refugee in 1972. So my publisher would say, oh, why do you want to include the map of Canada? Everybody knows where Canada is. I said, no, I'm trying to make a connection. And so this is Canada. Now this is militarization of scenic Afghanistan. It is so scenic, and it is. This is one particular, scenery that will catch your eye if you were ever to visit. Mountains, and it's just the landscape, and it's just so beautiful. Scenic Afghanistan. These are the prairies. These are the scenic Canadian Rockies. All right, but there is no militarization here. This is in the West. Right? So this is Chai with the anthropologist and her daughter. This is what we do. This is the kind of work we do. We visit families and we have chai with them, and they're always so very hospitable. This is an extended family, and so just really found it very enriching to see how people were living in the context of extended families and being there, to network and to engage into reciprocal relationship. So I have a story to share from Afghanistan. And I really like this image because when I look at her face, I think her face is saying, I have lots of stories to tell. Just listen to me. And this is, I have a story to share, and she's in Canada. And she shared her story with me as well. And she got an award because she was doing some good work for the women in Canada. So, and then this is a barbed wire. Everywhere I went, I came across barbed wire, and I just feel so sad because if there is going to be an attack, he is the first one to be killed, and probably he's the only breadwinner for the family because he is risking his life to protect foreigners. So talk about justice and hierarchy. And this is barbed wire in Burnaby. I make this connection. First of all, we are scared. We have gates outside our homes. And so we need to name what is happening in the West as well. I consider it as a barbed wire because I'm comparing this with what's happening in Afghanistan. But more importantly, a term that is used is gated communities. So gated communities means, that we are giving the message that this is our space. We bring our children within this confined space, and the neighborhood is of no interest to us. But in my work and in my teaching, I try to bring to light the importance of networking. And neighborhood is one space where we can make a beginning. So I wanted to bring this to light. So this is the enactment of violence. Many, many scenes like this I witnessed in Afghanistan. This is the future that Hamida wanted for her children. Children going to school, getting an education to the extent possible. Can I have the other slide, please? Okay. Yeah, the third one that you have. Yeah. So if you had told me, I would have been. Yeah, okay. So this is the landscape of scenic Afghanistan, mountains, Afghanistan, mosque, beautiful mosques. Going home from school. This is before the war. So what I really want to show, this is in Kabul. I really want to show, like, United States portrayed women in burqas just before they invaded Afghanistan, saying that these women are oppressed and they need to be liberated. But I want to show that they were liberated even before women were liberated in the West fully. And although I have to add a qualifier that this was just in the city, it was in Kabul. But these are Afghan women. Here they are, professionals. Okay. This is the scene before the war, living a peaceful life. Okay. Here, this is Bamiyan. I went there for a short time. This is scenery, beautiful. These are young Afghans. They share their tea and music, pre-war time. Okay. So this is Kabul, pre-war period. What I mean by pre-war is before it was invaded. This is Nowruz celebration, just see what you can see. High school, college, and then the foreign occupation and what it does to the country. Foreign occupation, militarization of the country, foreign occupation, again, US petrol mission, Afghan boys near an army tank. I wonder what kind of memories they are embodying being near the army. And this is women this is after invasion. They are trying to help families making pottery. And this is, post-war, going to school. And these are, okay, so I won't continue. That's about it. I am to read just a passage from my book, Afghanistan Remembers, and then we'll open it up for discussion because we have time, right? So, I just have very short passages that I'd like to read. So we anthropologists, we make extensive notes. When we come back, we have prolific notes from our field trip. So it was on the fine day of 28th August 2008 when my plane descended into Kabul. As we reached the ground, the majestic mountains gave way to the sight of myriad military helicopters stationed at the airport. There were two kinds: US NATO choppers equipped with latest technology, and the older battle-worn remnants from the time of the Soviet occupation. The helicopters served as a tangible reminder of the long-term and continuing violence that has plagued the people of Afghanistan. As I drove along city streets accompanied by an armed guard, I observed military convoys speeding while the rest of the traffic came to a halt. They, the foreign troops, had the right of way, as I found out was the case with many things in the country. I wrote in my diary, "This country is at war, but with whom?" Surely over 100,000 US NATO troops would not have been deployed to fight the Taliban, the insurgents. So that was one. And the other one that I want to read is, let me see if I can just read this. So the question that needs to be asked is, what impact will indigenous militarization have on the lived realities of Afghans? Will their children go to school? Will they have shelter over their heads? Will they have enough food to feed their families? Will they be in a position to celebrate religious occasions? Will it be safe for them to go out? Will they be able to socialize with kith and kin? Will they have access to health facilities? So I'm referring here to indigenous militarization. What I mean is that when Soviet Union left Afghanistan and United States decided to depart, they tried to, in fact, train, put into place Afghan military. And I'm questioning, how can we bring about peace when the foreign powers, in fact, militarize the local people, the local soldiers? And that's the question that needs to be asked and to be reflected upon. So what exactly is their agenda? Why would they want to be put Afghans in a position whereby they just kind of leave the country and ask Afghan soldiers to do the job of keeping Afghanistan militarized for a long period of time? And that's their legacy as far as I can see. So I think I'm going to stop here, and let's open it up for questions now and comments.
Okay. Do we need to use the microphone if there are people? Or should we? Please.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I have a few related questions. Firstly, the way that you articulate women's stories, given how you frame their agency and victimization, how powerful are these stories if structural inequalities exist? So what kinds of interventions do these stories make? And secondly, you say that you don't frame women as victims, that they have agency. How can they have agency if they are circulating in a system, as you say, that is framed through stark binaries between the West, the global North, and the global South? And thirdly, related to that, is that true? I mean, is it really as simple as that? What about local collusion? What about Afghans reading their history well? It's a graveyard of empires. This military occupation that we're seeing is not the first, and it probably won't be the last. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, these are excellent questions. So in terms of how powerful are these stories, I would say that the impact of stories is to actually let the world know the suffering that people are subject to, and the way in which the people themselves, in fact, act to reverse their suffering to a limited extent. And the reason why I say this, I want to just give an example. A lot of NGOs moved into Afghanistan after 2001. You know, they saw the opportunity, and there was kind of really Afghanistan had too many NGOs, and it looked like everywhere, every little place you would go to, there was an NGO at work. Now, what the NGOs did, this non-government organization, what they would do is they would by and large, introduce Western paradigms in terms of how Afghan women would cope with their suffering. So they would say, well, if an Afghan woman was, for example, if she was going through any kind of abuse within the family, they would say, okay, we have got a women's shelter, and how about if you just move into this shelter? And they totally overlooked the importance of family in the lives of Afghan women, the fact that they had a very strong bond with their children. And so that was not a viable strategy. So what I mean is that it is through, what I mean by powerful stories is that it is through stories that women not only highlight the issues that they are confronted with, but also the kind of interventions that they desire, that then other organizations could do a follow-up and implement them. With respect to your second question, how can they exercise their agency while they are being subject to oppression, right? Well, and I don't mean, I mean oppression, structural oppression or militarized oppression.
No,
now,
in the discourse, so you frame the discourse as between binary. So there are structural inequalities. So how do these stories circulate? How do they intervene? Do you see them as interventions? Can they really challenge that structural, social, economic, and political violence? What is the function of these stories if those structural inequalities continue to exist?
Yes, that's a very good observation. I would say that stories do not bring about change on a massive scale, but they do play a role in bringing about significant change on a small scale. What I have observed is that it's those small actions, what happens within limited space does matter. For example, if women were to come together and address one particular issue, they would be doing so in the context of the limited space, but they would be presenting a model of how things can improve. But they would not be in a position to improve the situation of other women just within their own locality. And this is how change can be brought about. And your question about circulating stories, Iva Ong, she's an anthropologist. It's a researcher's responsibility to ensure that these stories form part of the international circuit, so that we begin to see the complicity of larger structure forces. Your third point about the history of Afghanistan, yes, I totally agree with you, but my focus was on recent history. The reason why I went to Afghanistan is I wanted to actually bring to light the point that Afghanistan was invaded not to liberate the women. It was invaded not to introduce democracy along Western models, but for an agenda, an economic agenda that was totally at polar ends with the reasons and the rationale that was given earlier, or that was given in the media. I mean, the media just caught on to this particular image of burqa. And if you look at pre-invasion period in December 2001, you will find the newspapers have images that that just kind of focused on burqa and not very much else. So we are going there to liberate the women of Afghanistan. And a lot of Western feminists came on board, you know, with the same rationale. So that was the issue.
Any other questions and comments? Please.
Hi. Of the women that you interviewed in Canada, in particular, women that had immigrated to Canada as refugees, asylum seekers, etc., did they comment on the role that the men in their lives played, in particular shaping how they interact outside of the house, what their role is inside of the house, whether men played an oppressive role, or whether they kind of created a safe space for example?
Yeah, there was no homogenized. Story. You know, I mean, each story is singular. You know, it's different. So some women talked about the support that they had from men, particularly when men were not the first ones to find work. Other women did discuss how the men had a very their husbands had a very unsettling feeling because they were working and their husbands were at home. And there were other women who understood the workings of patriarchy, and they realized that this is not something that the change can come about overnight. So, but they were aware of it, and they were gradually working towards bringing about social change. I did not come across a lot of women who actually wanted to separate from their husbands. They had the interests of the children at heart, and they just said that, well, this is part of migration. They were separated from their kinship folk, and sometimes they found themselves struggling alone, but still they were determined to move forward. And they had this ambition that the children would get an education and would not have to go through what they were subject to.
This might be almost asking too much, but do you think if children were out of the question, would the situation be very different?
You mean if there were no children?
Right.
Yeah.
Or if they were not as concerned about their children's future?
Let me think. I didn't come across Afghan families who had no children. I did not come across a situation of that nature. But I also did interviews with Afghan families in Vancouver, and I found that when it came to shopping or when it went to establishing connections, a lot of them are now using internet and Facebook. They usually do it with other women, and that's their resource. They did not talk a lot about men, and my understanding is that their primary form of support are other women, kinship ties, and that's why it did not feature very heavily in my in the questions and in the stories that they relayed to me.
Thank you.
For the webinars.
Just a little comment to say that, is it possible to say the same things that you did without referring to politics and without referring to what is happening in the Western world, like, giving the same stories of ethnography, but not referring to the political agenda, so that you are neutral?
It is very difficult to take a neutral stance. We see war and violence on our television screens within the comfort of our living rooms. And if you want to make a connection, you have to understand why there are so many, now millions of refugees who are on the move, then it's impossible to talk about them without politics. So I think politicization is in the forefront.
Just to, another question that has just come up, that you mentioned the Afghan, the the bombarding of Afghanistan, but you didn't mention there is the initial aspect about New York, about the Twin Towers. And that was why, so, do you think that, we are also prejudiced in our approach to telling the story?
Yes.
We are not telling the story of the Western media, of the Western nations,
Yes.
where we have got the security here.
Yes, I did refer to it. I said the Twin Towers or the 9/11 incident, it was a tragedy. We grieve for the people who lost their lives. We mourn for what happened, in New York and Pentagon. But my point was that, this form or this kind of tragedy does not warrant invading a whole country. Like, I think over 1,300 people lost their lives, and we are really sad that this happened. But it does not give us the rationale to go and invade another country. And so I just feel that the invasion was not warranted.
So the anthropological study would not happen without referring to all these nuances that you have. Can we do that without? This is my question. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a historian and into thought.
Anthropologists lean towards studying, disenfranchised populations, socially marginalized people. And because their respondents are from these constituencies, they kind of are drawn towards identifying these structural factors. I think it is my discipline that draws me towards this analysis.
I hope I'm not repeating everybody else, but one comment and a couple of questions. My question, actually my comment it's in relation to the question you asked about the role of these stories. So I work with Afghan women, I'm researching Afghan women, and exactly that point, I'm researching exactly that point where women gather together and they talk and they share what is its function. And in my experience, it does perform a function of bringing change. Despite the fact you said it's sort of small change, I feel that a lot of changes that we ascribe to other events like the intervention of the US into Afghanistan that got women to take off their burqas, one of the things I realized in my research was that it is women talking about things like showing your face in public and the repercussions of it and the benefits of burqa or not wearing it, or talking about the person who did choose to keep it on or who chose to take it off. In these stories, enables women to come to a conclusion whether they want to take it off now that they have a choice or they want to keep it on. And then collectively, they can go and then pressurize the actual decision makers who are the men and their family. So I think it has, and this is a point that needs to be studied a lot more, because although we say women have agency, but we restrict their agency, our ascription of their agency onto something very small, which is sort of more of a performance rather than actual achieving an actual result. And I think that needs to be studied a little bit more. So that was my comment. My questions at you, and I think it sort of relates to your question. You said about how women are doing bottom-up recovery work. Now, recovery from what? And I think that sort of touches on masculinity. When we talk about militarization, who gets militarized actively? It's men. And I feel like a lot of the times when we talk about Afghanistan and Afghan women, we sort of forget about the fact that a lot of militarization actually has impacted the behavior of Afghan men, the perception of Afghan idea of masculinity, and that there's also a space of violence. And when we talk about Afghan women and their reactions and their stories, it's also a reaction, a story of the result of the militarization. Afghan women do have very substantial losses in the battlefield. They lose their breadwinner and so on and so forth. But they also are victims of the militarized men who are de facto decision makers on their lives. So I think I'd like you to just sort of, it sort of relates to your point. And the last thing, it relates to yours, and sorry, you raised it first, but I always wonder whether your positionality as an anthropologist, did you go in searching for stories of the impact of American occupation, or did you listen to the stories and decided that it was an occupation? And where does your positionality how does your positionality fit into this? Because I, as an African woman, get a very different story. And I always wonder whether years of not military intervention, but development intervention has something to do with it. Mm-hmm. Because when you ask a question, and depending on your own, the power dynamics, what kind of answer do you get? Sorry, I sort of went on and on.
But the fact that, there were so many NGOs straight after that, so it proves a point.
Yeah, just a little point to illustrate that. When I was growing up in northern Afghanistan, it was a big shame to go and ask for bread. But then there was a big WFP program that started distributing bread. So then it became more or less like a game. How many bread could you get? How many cards would you have? So it got to a situation where everybody had multiple cards. Now, how we got these cards, it was more, of course there was a need, there was poverty. However, we started, when surveyors came, we started recognizing who these surveyors were and who different people were, and what could we do to get an extra card. Then people started selling those breads, or making it dry and turning it sort of kind of like a porridgey thing, and adding sugar and making it into like less of a poverty-based need, but more of a luxury snack. And so I have seen that being played out. So I wonder where your positionality sort of relates to that.
Yeah.
Take this microphone off me before I
I think it's human nature to maximize on the resources, particularly when one is struggling. Like, a lot of families were rendered poor because of war and militarization. So when they saw that all these NGOs had come to Afghanistan, it's not that they were opposed to their work, but they learned how to negotiate with them, to navigate around issues and to maximize on the resources. So if they can get 4 ration cards instead of 1, it's human nature. They are going to go for it because they have families to feed. And yes, I would say that after particularly in the aftermath of violence and war, this situation can arise. So I didn't find it surprising that it was happening. I also observed that when they would be given school uniforms, or when they could gain more resources than what was allocated to them. It's bound to happen because they are struggling with poverty. Your point, I think you raised so many points that I guess I also lost track. But there's one particular person called Dennis Kanyoti. You might know her work. And she talks about violence and patriarchy and, militarization on the part of males, the military ethos that males embody. And she actually traces this to the workings of structural factors. It is their means of survival, so they feel that, when the kinship ties have been diminished or has been scattered, they feel that they need to take greater control. They need to be, head of families in a way that may appear to be oppressive. But Kanyoti says that we must not overlook the workings of resources. In terms of, because the resources, both capital resources, human resources, and also from the point of view of materiality. In terms of whether I had a bias when I went to Afghanistan, you know, in my book, in the very first page or two, I talk about my own story, because I have been subject to violence of a different kind. When we left Uganda, I lost my brother and I lost my grandmother. And you know, these things, you know, they just don't slip out of your memory. They are images that are very powerful. So because I grew up in Uganda, I was I actually had experiential understanding of the workings of colonialism. And so when I went to Afghanistan, yeah, I would say that, you know, I had this particular understanding that this particular country has not been left alone, that it has been subject to militarization, and it's something that I need to capture through the viewpoints of the women, not my viewpoint. So even if I had a bias, I would have, and I wouldn't call it bias, I would say a particular perspective, a particular, you know, when we go into the field, we have a particular vision as to why we are going into the field. We go through ethics review, and in the ethics review, we do spell out what is the rationale, what kind of work are you going to do, what kind of objectives do you want to advance. These are questions that we need to address. And so if I found that, you know, the women were telling me something quite different, then I would have, that's the kind of analysis I would have done. But they were not. They were very much aware of how their lives had been impacted by militarization. And keeping in mind that the hijackers, they didn't come from Afghanistan. Majority of them were Saudi Arabia. So, you know, it was a very unfair situation that I felt had to be documented. I hope I've responded to your questions.
Thank you.
I think, I don't want to be oppressive, but no, I think we have good hands. So I think we should thank Dr. Dossa.
Thank you very much.
It was my pleasure, and it was really nice to get your feedback and comments and questions. And thank you for organizing this. And thank you to Laila for, you know, we had several email conversations, and you've been very efficient and very well organized.